Welcome back to the show. Today I have a guest. I'd like to introduce him, or let him introduce himself. What is your name?
Hi, my name is Eli Komai, living here in San Diego, born and raised in Chula Vista. And just the more time that goes on, I think people get more and more surprised that I'm local.
What does that name mean, Eli?
Eli is a nickname. It substitutes for Lysiasa. It's Laisiasa. Lysiasa is the Fijian way of saying Elijah. That's their word for the prophet Elijah. My dad is from Fiji, the same place where they bottle the Fiji water at. In fact, his mom's village is adjacent to the village that sold their aquifer rights to the Canadian company that bottles Fiji water. So Elijah, they actually have a lot, since they were a British colony, they have a lot of prophet names around because when they were colonized by the British, they brought over Christianity too, along with a lot of other trappings of Western civilization. And so there's a lot of guys running around with names like Lightia, which is another way of saying Elijah, or one of my favorites is Eparama, which is short for Abraham. But for Lysiasa, I don't see how you can get Lysiasa from Elijah. Eparama I can see it for Abraham. But yeah, Lysiasa is a fun one. So that's why I go by Eli.
But you were born here in San Diego.
Yes. I've lived in San Jose for 2 years, San Jose, California, and then in Pomona, California for another 2 years, about 2 years apart. I went to San Jose State for school, and then came back to San Diego for 2 or 3 years, and then I went and finished my schooling in Pomona, California, at the east edge of Los Angeles County. So I'm formally trained in hospitality management, which is just a fancy business degree. It's a specialized business degree with a big focus on service, psychology, and a touch of commercial real estate finance. So it's basically everything from the commercial real estate tract and marketing, the plot and the tract of land that you find it on, how the facilities have been developed from the ground up, all the way to how to, help people out in the workplace, like emotionally too, because we take care of two kinds of customers. External customers, which is what you'd normally think of when talking about customers, and internal customers, which are your employees, which are people you serve as well. And
quite the articulate fellow, I might add.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've had a lot of practice. I guess just having good conversations, meaningful conversations like the one here. When I'm talking to folks who aren't as articulate, it's just because they haven't been afforded the opportunity to flap their wings a little bit. But it's like a muscle. The more you use it, the more it will grow and flourish and develop. It breaks my heart when I see people that barely know how to write or talk or put their thoughts into words. And that's it's liberating to be able to say how you truly feel.
Where do you think that came from for you?
My last 2 years of hospitality school, one of the professors, his name is Ed Merritt, Edmerrit, or it's RITT. Ed Merritt had us write these crazy long reports on every little thing we observed at our workday. To make it through the Collins College of Hospitality Management, you had to work in the industry as a requirement. That's why I kind of like the program. It's also kind of why it's so successful. They require you to be out there, get your feet wet, and see how the real world is rather than just in an incubated classroom. So one of our teachers, Ed Merritt, made the most of this fact, and he said, every day at work, when you get home, or when you wake up the next morning, you write this really detailed report. You answer all these questions. And he had so many questions about this. And so I just got used to writing very detailed reports. And after I started writing the reports, it got me better at observing the world around me, observing the people I worked with, observing just the interactions, the nuances, what was on this wall at this time or when this door was open, all this other stuff. And police can tell you the same thing. If the more you write reports, the better you actually become at observing, because you'll realize, your brain will realize, oh, I could write this down later, or that's something, that I can notice, because it'll allow me to have a more detailed recount when I have to put pen to paper or start typing on the keyboard. And that's basically how I got so, I guess, articulate, is when I would have to expound on at first it was a bunch of nothing. And now if you can write a lot and get really into the nitty gritty of just, regular day-to-day stuff, then you kind of just become more talkative in general, or you have something to say about everything. And that's not being opinionated or being a complainer. It's really finding the beauty in just all these little things that are happening from day to day, and being able to talk to them, to compliment them.
How old were you when you were doing this?
Early 20s. I was 24, 25. My prefrontal cortex is just finishing its last development, or major developments, and I was writing these reports, and I was coming to my own. I was actually so dedicated to school, I was under-challenged by many of the classes, and I ended up reading in my free time. So I started reading about world history, stuff like more fascinating subjects that came across my plate, which was like economics, or this one study, sociology, which is like a fancy economics / history / anthropology. Read a great work in my time there, and that's how I kind of woke up slowly, is just reading some of those white papers on sociology, seeing history. That's actually how the founder of my organization woke up. He just read a ton of history, and he realized, whoa, you read history to make sense of today.
What is this organization? Is that what you're doing now?
Yes, I work right now for the John Birch Society, and that was founded by Robert Welch, who was a child prodigy. He read a 9-volume history text of the world, of human history, by age 12. And he was already kind of like a bookworm by then. He graduated college, standing a full shoulder at the shoulders of his classmates, even the shorter ones. So he's a classic story of, this is a really smart, egghead kid. He eventually went on to succeed in the real world outside of academia, which is where, unfortunately, some bright people fall short. And he started his own candy company along with his brother, the Welch Candy Companies. He invented the Sugar Daddy, if you're familiar with that, and then Sugar Babies, which are just like caramel pops. And the processing and having a successful factory that manufactures that. So he was a millionaire by the time he and his wife kind of retired from that gig of running the Welch Candy Company. And by the time he was retired, he was again a well-read, well-spoken man, and he realized at around the 1940s, 1950s, that the United States, the country around him, was slowly being molded by unseen forces, slowly being molded into a carbon copy of many despotic regimes that have come throughout history, that have come and gone throughout history. And he's like, here we have the great American experiment, and it's slowly trying to be something out there, and invisible forces trying to convert it into a dictatorship or some sort of thing that it's not originally devised to be. Like many other countries in the world, there are wicked men out there seeking to control other men, and he saw the foreshadows of it happening here. Now, you don't have to be a genius or a child prodigy to kind of see the writing on the wall, to see how the dominating and controlling of someone's mind or body can be on display here in the modern day. You don't have to be a genius to connect those dots and see what's going to come around the corner. In the early 40s and 50s, you kind of had to be pretty well steeped in that to see the signs. Now, any person who is aware of communism can kind of see that happening here. In fact, when we rally together, some of the most patriotic of our number are the Vietnamese San Diegans. And they're so patriotic because they know what communism looks like, and then they can smell it happening here.
It's a very insidious thing. It's not always overt, it's not always obvious, but those who have lived it start to finish know the nuance, know the details, even the minute sensory input of what does it smell like? What does it actually feel like when someone who wants to control everything about my life comes into my life? I think some people have a taste of that in relationships, and certainly in today's world we're experiencing a taste of that in California, and I think that's what brought us together. So would you say that this is the greatest problem we have in our city of San Diego, in our state of California, in our country, or in the world? If it isn't, what is the greatest problem we have?
The American experiment sought to liberate man from oppression of other men, specifically King George of England. Wanted to make men free to do as they saw fit, only being constrained by the boundaries of their morality. And many founding fathers have said that this only works if we're a moral and just people. You know, this republic is wholly unfit to anyone that is amoral or immoral and unjust to others, or unjust to their livestock. You know, they're not going to get very far if they're not treating their cows right, or their farmland right, the environment correctly. If they're not morally, they don't have a moral compass with how they treat the land, their brothers and sisters. This experiment will crumble because it relies so heavily on morality and other people. The biggest threat, to answer your question, the biggest threat it is wicked people with no morality, no values, trying to enslave other people, trying to use, not use them. Capitalism seeks to use people to better the world, to provide the most value, the most utility. Communism abuses people. It doesn't use them, it abuses people. If you're at a job and you think, gosh, this is a waste of time, or why does this rule even exist? It doesn't make sense. These rules don't make sense. That's because you're not being used, you're being abused. These are communist rules or statutes, orders, decrees, because it's abusing the system, and you can tell because it doesn't make sense. It's a hallmark of a communist ordinance or decree.
Where do you think these wicked people come from?
Many times they're birthed out of their own ego, they're self-serving, and everybody has this in them. It's like a self-serving, kind of animalistic, dog-eat-dog kind of survival thing that's in the back of our heads, in our animal brain. But sometimes, and this is where the really wicked ones come in, they are discipled in, they are raised, and they are trained to be this way. And they are especially wicked because they have guidance and leadership. Just like the most noble and good people have been led as disciples of Jesus, or a church, or a good leader, or a saint. These wicked people have been led along this path. It's just fast tracking it because you're standing on the shoulders of other people. So they're fast tracked into this wickedness and this battle for control of other people, of other people's souls. They want to doom folks. And fast tracking it is what really allows these folks to be very extra wicked, extra mean to others, or have zero regard for others. And you can kind of see this with like how Antifa fast tracks, just college kids who aren't really happy with the way their lives are going. Antifa fast tracks and BLM fast tracks that because they're making essentially disciples. I have some Antifa material. I mean, you read that stuff and it's like, yeah, It's a quick and dirty, primer for, oh yeah, these problems in your life are not your faults. They're the man's fault. And let's get back at them. Let's tear down society. Some of the Antifa stuff is rather like has an anarchy bent to it. Well, let's destabilize. Let's destabilize. We're ungovernable. That's a classic tagline from Antifa, even in its early days in the United States. We are ungovernable, meaning they're essentially overtly trying to undermine government.
Can you define Antifa?
I think it's a front group. The insiders, as the society and many others like to call them, these wicked people in these inner circles, inner circles, these wicked people have many front groups. The outer circle. One of the front groups is Antifa, or CPUSA, Communist Party United States of America. The communists is one of the front groups. Communists is not the end to itself. John Birch Society always says, oh, we're anti-communist. Yes, but actually, beyond that, we're looking at the inner circle that is behind the communists. The communists are just one of the members of the outer circle, one of the appendages, one of the branches of the tree. From what I've seen, the society is the only group, the only organization that squares up with the core, with that inner circle. Alex Jones was on to the CFR in the 90s. Robert Welch was on to the inner circle in the 1950s.
Do you think that the people who are deemed or dubbed conspiracy theorists, do you think that they're just clever investigators who dig deep enough to initiate a pattern of fear that maybe, just maybe, the fabric of our society is stitched together by those in control, and that those people in control, or maybe even just institutions in control, have lost their moral compass somewhere? Do you think that they've simply lost this moral compass along the way?
I actually think a lot of them mean very well. A lot of people still have a lot of good in them. It's just the direction, the leadership that has been infiltrated and subverted. So if it hasn't been infiltrated, it's been harshly subverted with these ideas, these ideals. And it plays out, and you can see it. There's a bunch of rules that don't make sense. Why? Because they're abusing that system. These subverters have been practicing subversion, communist-style subversion, for a long time. They'll try and allow their ideals, to permeate all levels of that leadership and control. And because they recognize it's easier to change that control structure than it is to change society at large. The Christian church, or any church, has a task to change society for the better, or for its own aim, which is, the salvation of mankind. These guys, they're trying to, and that's a hard job, changing everybody. That's a lot of people. In fact, some people say, oh, it's a monumental task because there's so many people. You can see the people who are for depopulation. One of the cited reasons, I don't know if this is actually a thing, depopulation, but one of the cited reasons for why the insiders want to depopulate is because then a smaller group of people is easier to control. Well, vice versa, you flip that on its head, a larger group of people, harder to control, and it makes your task much bigger, exponentially larger, to try and bring them to the light, or bring them into this new kind of depraved mental state where humans are living like animals. So I don't believe it's these guys in leadership positions. A lot of them mean very well. It's just subversion, infiltration. It's like it's been going on, but I believe there are still plenty of really good people. It's just we need to make sure that I don't want to say like convert to Christianity or go to a church, but like get some good mentorship, get some good leadership, have somebody fast track your morality, your moral compass, because right now culture is being undermined. Culture is on the ground level is being subverted, and that's a big target too. They're actually doing a full court press. They're not just infiltrating positions of power, but they're also trying to exert force onto the culture to make every person at the ground level more deprived and more in a fearful kind of animalistic state.
I would agree. I think that when you have a large population, it's easier to control them with basic psychological techniques such as fear, greed. And I wonder if they got more clever over time and they discovered that, yes, divide and conquer is the single best, most efficient way of defeating an enemy. But when you have a large body, many, many people to control, and you're perhaps used to controlling a small population, I think the mere fact that it is a larger group plays into their hand as well, because when you have so much pressure interpersonally, when you have so much relationship pressure, such as going to the market and trying to shop for items without wearing a mask because you have common sense and you're a scientist or you're religious and you understand your risk and your threat factor in society. And you also understand what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And you understand perhaps what harassment looks and feels like, sounds like. You understand what communism looks and begins with. I guess my question now is, if these people need to find a good mentor, maybe a good mentor would be God. How would you define this word that we use so often? Perhaps this figure, this idea. What is God to you, Eli?
Great question. And I want to make a comment on, give you a compliment on the comment you just had. Yeah, with the masks, I mean, it should be up to our own, we should be at liberty to decide what we do with our own bodies. That's just wicked trying to tell other people what they can do. Take that basic liberty away from somebody. I mean, for no proof, the illusion of safety, the perception of safety. For God, finding God, again, that's a tough one. That takes a lot of considerable introspection, observation of outside forces, and effort. And all of that, the pursuit of that can be fast-tracked with a mentor. So having God as a mentor is great if you're able to tap into that right away. If not, the next best thing that can fast-track that is having somebody who is kind, is always warm-hearted, caring, cognizant, is well-spoken, or is just, and you can't tell this stuff just on day-to-day interactions. You actually have to sit down with them or spend an evening with them. Go, not even on a hike. Like hike, you can just climb up and just walk the trail. But really, if you sit down or you serve alongside them, work with them long enough, you can kind of tell if they're a good person or not. And then you just take the most noble, charismatic, I wouldn't say charisma would be a defining factor, but just good and noble people who mean very well. I would say you ask them, what's your secret? What do you believe? Most of the time they'll say, I believe in a God, I believe in a creator, that we're not here by accident, and it's up to me to live up to my purpose, up to what I've been placed here to do. And then you ask them, that's where, would you mind taking me on as a disciple or taking me on under your wing? This is all new stuff to me. And then that's how that mentorship begins. And life is very rich, and there's a lot of beauty around us all the time that we can observe and look into, because we can admire the creation, which we are a part of.
I find a lot of beauty in moments. Even in stressful moments, there are these kind of moments of reprieve. And I see footage nowadays, and I suppose I should declare what day we're talking about. So this day and age is March of 2021. The world is still afflicted with this situation, and I wouldn't call it a biological threat or a hazard or a weapon or anything like that. I would just say that we're afflicted with this challenge. It seems to me like in the face of this challenge, there are moments of incredible beauty, just like in a war or in a context that is dark, we can find light. And I think the contrast is made more evident with the severity changing. So My question directly is, what does God mean to you?
The light shines brightest in the darkness. And if we're going through dark times, if you manage to stay bright, then it will show clearly to others. Like if you're that to people who are searching for that bright spot in their life, you can be that much more easily, much more readily. Why? Because not everybody's bubbly and cheery. A lot of people are downtrodden and are afraid to even look each other in the eyes or even say hi to each other when passing. So being that light is easier now. God to me is a creator. He made us in his own image. So if we want to understand God, we kind of just have to look at ourselves and understand ourselves, because we are made after him. We are his children. And so if you want to know a little bit about our nature, and some of the more wicked things, like some of the bad stuff that's in our nature, that's stuff that God can do, but he can do it because he's God. He's God. He can be, wrathful and all this other stuff. You get some Old Testament, like fire brimstone kind of God. That's stuff that we can identify with. We want to be number one. We want to be the tops. And he says, well, listen, you're not the tops. Even though I made you in my own image, you can't be number one. I am. So knowing your place under him is the biggest difference between us and God. We have to be subservient to him. That's not built into us because it wasn't built into God. It wasn't built into the blueprint we were created from. And that's kind of hard. And that's where we see a lot, that's the hardest part about being somebody who's churched or spiritual, is to kind of divorce ourselves from these godly behaviors. And I mean these bad godly behaviors, because there's a lot of really good behaviors that we can exhibit that we inherited from God, but there's ones that, have no place in humanity because we're not God. And what's crazy is running across people who have God complexes and, want to run their own show, and it's not fun dealing with them. But there are many of them out there.
Is that a slight?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm not throwing mud at anybody, but I've heard of stuff like one of my customers, she worked at, I think it was Spaywar, and she mentioned how a lot of engineers have God complexes. Because I was working on her fridge, and I said a comment about the engineers who designed this Whirlpool fridge, and I noticed you have a Whirlpool fridge here too. Made a comment on the engineers, and she said in response, she made this comment about, oh yeah, a lot of engineers, just don't say that to them. You'll hurt their feelings. These guys have God complexes. I have known so many engineers that are just so full of themselves. It's like, oh gosh. Well, I mean, that's an interesting thing, but it's not just engineers, but it could be anyone. It could be a foreman. It could be a cashier. It doesn't matter, any walk of life really. You can see somebody who is like self-obsessed and they live in their own little world, and God complex. They're like, oh, I'm the king or whatever. That's pretty dangerous to have, because then you have people who are disconnected and self-centered, and it's really hard to connect with those people.
So, with church being divided, so many different branches of religion, so many different belief systems, how do people find constancy in Christianity? Why should people choose Christianity if they don't currently have a religion? Maybe they're growing up and they're young and their parents aren't religious, but they're thinking about it. What exactly is it about this belief you have?
Well, Protestant Christianity is the lightest touch of religion, because the real purpose of the religion is to make somebody more spiritual and set them with some sort of a structure, so it's fast tracks your spirituality. Of all the religions, I think Christianity, like Protestant Christianity, has the least amount of superstructure built on top of the infrastructure of spirituality, leading a spiritual life. Infrastructure is key. That's the goal. The superstructure what's built on top of it is it's just a means to get you there. And so the less of that there is, the better, because otherwise it detracts from the infrastructure. It detracts from your spiritual walk. In Christianity, I found that, and it depends on which, so many denominations, but the ones that usually have the least amount of their own internal rules, their own internal regulations, because that's stuff that's devised by man. The ones that focus more on Scripture, on God's commands, on the writings of the prophets, the ones that focus on just that have generally, I've found, less superstructure. That allows people to be free to pursue the infrastructure, to pursue that spiritual life. With just the church as a very small framework, it's very similar to the United States, where you should be free to pursue your own craft or trade, and with as little superstructure to impede you, with as little regulation and rules, just like the church would impose a bunch of rules. Before we started recording, we were talking about the Catholic Church and how that has a lot of just extra regulations piled on top. I actually know a lot of great Catholics. Some of my best, most spiritual friends are Catholic, and the structure works great. It's there for those who need it, and they're very spiritual. It's just we've heard of many denominations in the Christian church and Catholics going astray because they're caught up in all these superstructure level rules and regulations, because it's now overshadowing and completely covering up the infrastructure of spirituality. And it's very important to just find a church to fast track you that focuses on Scripture. If you need that bare line structure, like baseline, the less structure, the better. And it depends on your temperament, depends on who you are, how much structure you need, how much of that superstructure you need. Some of my Catholic friends, they need that, and they get a lot out of prayer, and they mean a lot. They're not just mindlessly repeating words when they say the rosary. They actually mean it, and they thrive in that kind of structured environment. But for those of you who are more like lone wolf cowboys, you'd be pretty well to do in a Protestant church, specifically I'm biased here by saying this, but like a Wesleyan kind of Methodist church. I think they got it pretty well right. Arminian or Wesleyan church, you have that, I think, great recipe for small amount of superstructure, but an amazing way to fast track somebody's spirituality with just a minimal amount of human devised rules and more just God devised rules for how to live your life and be a spiritual person.
Do you think that Christians, by and large, are more welcoming to people who think differently than they do?
Yes, we were taught to have grace, or we're told, and hopefully taught to have grace towards others, regardless of what they are. And the Catholics will also say this too, and it's because it's Abrahamic thought. All life is sacred, has value, and it's immense value, to the point where we can't really deny anybody really that much. We have to give them the light of day. We have to show that grace. With the left, as we see in the United States, they don't have that grace. If you're against them, you're no more than a piece of trash or walking meat. They won't hesitate to off you if it reaches their goals, because with the left, the ends always justify the means, and the left will always eat their own, because the second they deviate from the inner circle or from the insiders or whoever's on the take of the next coup, they'll off you. But before we go into politics or jump back into there, before we leave religion, I want to say there is a very, very small insanely small number of people out there who are able to actually have a very full spiritual walk without the church, meaning their temperament, they are so independent and so self-starting that you can be very spiritual without joining a church. There are some out there, but if you feel like you're coming up short, on your own. And that's incredibly tough. And that's quite the undertaking. You have to be quite the lone wolf. It's a very small number of people that are capable of doing this. If you're not that small number, very small number who are super self-driven, self-starting, and can be very spiritual, I would advise you to get mentorship. You don't have to join a church, but it certainly helps to find somebody who would be a good mentor, who could lead you and fast track that progress into that full spiritual life, and that will make your efforts. It'll redouble your efforts. It'll provide you a set of shoulders to stand upon, because it takes a ton to do this on your own. I tried to for many years, and it took a lot out of me, and it didn't provide any level of accountability because it was all on me. So I was left to my own devices, good or bad. And so that level of autonomy and freedom is great. But again, there's no set of shoulders for you to stand on and structure to magnify your progress. Because see, that little bit of superstructure is important.
Do you have any pieces of wisdom from the Bible or otherwise you'd like to share?
Oh, yes. I have a memory verse from 2 weeks ago from a young adults group out in Lakeside. Shout out to anyone who's listening. Let's see. Shout out to G Money. I'll just say that. Proverbs 16:3. Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. And that tells me that every time we put effort, commit your works to the Lord. Every time we put our efforts towards something, what are we doing it for? What are we committing them to? Is it so we can get a better house? Or is it so we can drive a fast car? Or is it so we can look better at the next presentation? What is the goal? What is your goal by committing this particular work? Is it with the Lord in mind, or is it with one of your selfish desires in mind? And that's something I'm struggling with, because sometimes when I say something or I act a certain way or I do something, sometimes I'll find, I'll ask myself, why am I doing this? Who am I doing this for? Does it glorify the Lord? Is this why He created me? And sometimes I'll find that, I'm actually just doing it for some vain reason, some really kind of dumb reason. It's just to impress this one person, or it's just to, look good for this group, or to make myself feel good, give me a little pat on the back. Like, I just got this Dodge Viper because, it'll make me feel good when I press down on the pedal. Well, Dodge Viper is actually a pretty terrible example. It's probably the most dangerous production car in history, or modern history, production sports car. But yeah, like say you get a Dodge Charger, because it goes burr when I press the pedal, and it makes, put some G's on my back, and makes me feel good. Like, is that an ends to means to an end? What is the end? You have the Lord in mind, or is it just because it feels good when you press on the pedal? And your plans will be established. That's the NASB translation. It's one of the more literal translations of the Bible. NASB for Proverbs 16:3, the last part of it is, and your plans will be established, or other translations have it, and your plans will be upright. Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. So when that's kind of just telling me that if you do things with the Lord in mind, with that infrastructure, that spirituality in mind, and you work as a spiritual person, working towards progress in that way, towards the Lord's goals, His aims, His purpose for your life, then your plans will be established, meaning it will be upright. It will be standing on something more solid than just your passing fancies. It'll be standing upon an infrastructure that others have worked on, that the Lord, has worked on. It will be upright. It'll stay there forever. It won't, wash away at the end of your life. It'll carry onwards.
So what is your relationship with science?
Interesting. I like science. It's here and there. I see a lot of science coming out. I'm not into science professionally or even as an amateur. So science is something that comes to me in tidbits, facts, and figures from time to time. And I've been seeing something really scary is a lot of selective science. Big pharma or special interests would be spending a lot of money on studies to, lean a certain biased studies. That's clear bias when you are seeking a particular result from a study. It's even if it's double blind, the way they would set it up with what they choose. I mean, there's so many variables and factors that they can still influence in a double blind that will try and tip the scales in their favor. So it's not an objective view on the universe or this particular aspect that they're trying to study. And that's pretty scary. I call it selective science, and we're seeing a lot of selective science just being pointed out in the press. Why? Because follow the money. Who's financing it? Why would you spend a couple $1,000,000 to produce these facts and figures? How does it help you? How does it help the world? Well, if it helps enslave the world, then I guess that's money well spent.
What is it about humankind? What part of humankind gives you hope or strengthens your faith?
Just like when we look at nature or when we have this kind of infrastructure, the spiritual infrastructure in mind, we can see so many beautiful things out in the world, out in the nature, and in other people. It's interesting to see qualities of the Lord or of somebody's better nature when you're looking for it. It pops out at me, and it shows me there's so many good people in the world, and there's people. Oh, why did you do that, Jim? Or Lance, why? That's very nice of you. That's a nice thing of you to do. What called that person to do that? They tapped in. They made a decision on their own to do something good, to do something right. Doesn't make his life easier. Didn't make Lance's life any easier. In fact, sometimes it makes it harder. But it's because you're helping, or in that case, Lance was helping others. He was serving. He was tapping into that better nature to allow a more fruitful life from everybody, to have grace, to exercise that. That's really important. I like when I see that in other people, when they choose to go out of their way, meaning, make some sacrifice on their part, even in small parts sometimes, to help others out. And it's these little things. Usually when we think of helping others out, we think, oh yeah, donate to a charity, gives to African children. No, literally helping your neighbors out. Why are you going to help people halfway around the world? That money is you can't follow that money. You can't. There's no way. But you can follow your neighbors. You can see what they do. You can help them out. Get in tune with their life, their struggles, band together. It's I don't know if it's a saying from the Bible, from somewhere else, but it says it's more important. A neighbor sometimes is more important than a brother far away. Your neighbor, the people who live right next to you in close proximity, is more important than an actual blood relative who's on the other side of the United States, or who's more distant. It's because these people are placed next to you here for a reason. And I'm not going to get too far out of the fatalist camp, which is the opposite of what I believe now. I used to be a fatalist. It says, everything's roll the dice. But, these people are here in your life for a reason, so get involved. Show them grace. If they don't want to be involved, still be as graceful as you can. Show that light to them. Especially now, it's very easy because everyone's got their head in the gutter. But you show that up, or they'll think you're trying to sell them something, So you think, what's your angle? There's got to be a catch. No, really, I'm just trying to help you out. I'm just trying to be a good person. You put it in plain terms like that. There are good people. You're a good person, Max. Great, I want to get involved with you more, or help you out, or I can call on you, can lean on you. And it's good for those people who are honestly seeking help, honestly seeking a friend, an ally. And there are some out there who will take advantage of that, will abuse that, because they don't recognize, like your question to me just now is like, that's awesome when you can recognize grace and you can recognize these spiritual acts in others. There are other people who are so into the animal kingdom, so back into the Stone Age, where they see a good act on your part and they just think, oh, I can take advantage of this guy. Because again, they're so self-centered. They can't even recognize like a spiritually inspired act when they see one. They just think, oh, here's a dummy that I can take advantage of. Here's a weakling. They'll take your grace as weakness, and they'll take advantage of that. And you'd want to make it very clear, I'm doing this because I am trying to extend my grace to you. I'm just trying to be a good person, brother. I will not allow myself to be taken advantage of, to be used, or not used, because the Lord is using you, but not be abused, not have that symbiotic relationship abused, like it is in, say, the communist schools of thought. They think that, oh, the managers can never be friends of the laborers. The managers always have to abuse the labor pool. It can never be a symbiotic relationship where they use one another to heighten each other, to raise each other up in like a true symbiotic relationship like we see in nature, where both sides benefit. The communists think, oh, it's a zero-sum game, or like a negative-sum game where the management will always be in conflict with the labor, where, oh, there is no use of the other party, there's only abuse. All sort of partnership is abuse. And that's really bad because it undermines the very fabric of society. Anyways, I digress, but again, when you show that grace to your neighbors, just the simple things, getting involved and doing that, that's how we save the culture on a micro level, really. And it's good to recognize when your neighbor does something nice for you, because then you'll know, oh, they're kind of looking out for this. They might not know why, but they're doing it. And it means that they still have those ideals. They still have that kind of gut instinct to be a good person. Why? Because it feels good, because that's how we're made. And it promotes, not a zero-sum game. It promotes a higher benefit for everyone, for all of civilization, for all creation. It helps the world.
For a variety of reasons, I think it's become easier to hide from that good feeling and the instinct to do a good thing for somebody. Whether it's the programming through the perspectives driven hard by these institutions in the modern world, the advertisements, the TV shows, the propaganda, the media, let's say, the media. I feel it's become easier for the power structure to control minds and to hide this instinct of goodness from the self, to remove the feeling of catharsis from doing a good deed for another. And part of that is scientific. In other words, part of that is embedded in the scientific dogma, such that we are hardwired to be violent. These kind of overt and oversimplifications, they pull back from the grace, and they pull back from the potential of the human spirit, because the human spirit is governed by will, but will to a community, will to relationships, not will to the self. I find myself being thankful and grateful to people for minute things, and others will look upon that and they'll say, you didn't even have to thank them. You didn't have to appreciate them. That was nothing. But to me, it's something. And that distinction process to decide what is valuable to you, what is valuable to the health of the community, valuable to the world, valuable to the future, these are conscious decisions. And one of the things that came up early when I met you was the Socratic Method. So, can you describe what the Socratic Method is and why it's important?
Yes. The Socratic Method is how the old philosopher Socrates, which is it's a household name. If it's not, then you're in a bad household and you better catch up. No. But the philosopher Socrates would destroy his opponents logically by using what he called the Socratic. Well, he didn't call it, but historians and philosophers call it the Socratic Method. And basically all it is Socrates' approach on how to logically win an argument. And this method is just asking a line of questions. You ask a line of questions to uncover somebody's argument. So when you ask questions, you put somebody on the defensive because now they're reactionary. They have to respond to what you say, which is a question. And so if you use a line of questions in the Socratic Method, you'll eventually elicit a bunch of responses. Now, when you ask them questions, you're asking them about their argument. So they say something like, oh, Trump lost. He lost. Something like that. And then you say, oh, really? Well, I won't run with the whole example all the way through, but you keep asking them a question like, where'd you hear that from? Or how did you know that? And you keep following up with questions, and you essentially it's based on their argument. You get to the core of their argument. Question by question, you peel back the layers of the onion of their argument, or you just peel back the layers, you dig down into the core of their argument. And if they have a strong and solid argument, then you'll see, oh, it's a nice iron core. That's awesome. I see your way now. That's the way it is, because that is a truth. That is like a natural truth. Or, you dig down enough layers, you strip back enough of the layers, and then there's like a soft cream filling. It's a nothing sandwich. Oh, your argument was based on falsehood or is based on pure conjecture. I know that now. I see it for what it is. Why? Because I've asked enough questions to get down to the core of it. And the Socratic Method is a very expedient and effective way at getting to somebody's core argument.
I think it's incredibly important in today's world because we are faced with these immediately uncomfortable situations in our dialogues, if we're even allowed to have those. When they do happen, I find it incredible when I ask a question such as, why did you say that? Because I can go straight to the heart and ask why. But the Socratic Method is actually a more devious but helpful way of getting the why without asking why. So it's tactically relevant, and I think it's psychologically powerful to work your way through carefully to establish understanding. Because yes, we can have different opinions, and yes, we can have different emotional reactions to things happening in the world today. But I think the ability to ask each other important, poignant, and prudent questions to establish understanding, and hopefully thus identify that understanding is the goal, will get us closer to a good world. I think the lack of understanding of where opinions or where ideas or where arguments even come from, that lack of understanding is causing more conflict. For example, one of the things that brought Eli and me together was the situation in the world, especially with the political world. And we had the 45th president of the United States do a very good job of keeping his word, of not being your standard bureaucrat, your standard politician in Washington, D.C., perpetuating a cycle of nonsense, unfortunately, whether it's war or theft via taxation, red tape and regulation, limiting the scope of religion in people's everyday lives, removing religion outright from schools, and these decisions that actually take away from the communities. We look at this individual in Trump, and we see all of the people out there who posit an argument such as, he lost the election in 2020. And many of us are called names in the media, which we understand to be essentially in the pocket of one political side and not the other. Because we are called names, and because the group of people out there who perpetuates that behavior, because we are treated this way, it is difficult for us to understand each other. If they asked us why we believed that he actually won the election in 2020, perhaps they would understand why we voted for him in the first place, and then perhaps we would understand each other. But our side, I think I can safely say our side, the side of reason, the side of faith, follows this method of asking important questions. And I agree with Eli that if you were to ask a person enough questions, especially a person who says that, oh, Donald Trump did not win in 2020, we would understand a lot about the person's insecurities. Because inevitably, I think a lot of these individuals who hurl nasty comments and these vain and hurtful things, they would understand themselves as a result of us understanding them. So it's about opening doors. And the Socratic Method is definitely a door opener and an eye opener.
What's the name of your method that you'd pursue with just the going straight for the jugular? Why did you say that? Is that the Max method?
I would say that my attitude tends to be closer to the no nonsense and the let's not beat around the bush kind of style. Other people actually enjoy the dialectics, the Hegelian dialectics of working their way. And I agree. I think when you have two interested people talking about one subject, you can learn a great deal and you can cite many different things, many different aspects. But in terms of this situation we're in the world today, the straight for the jugular phrase, I guess, that you mentioned, is more so referring to how important it's becoming to quickly convince a person that there is something not entirely correct about their first reaction, or perhaps to convince people that there is another mode of thinking. And this is challenging because of the programming, because of the media. And I think it's all guiding people to have a singular and unwavering view that they didn't create, that they didn't derive.
They've been led there by devious devisers, the insiders, the conspiracy, right? They'll realize, oh, they're being abused by the news media, by the insiders. They'll recognize that pretty quickly. That's a great question, question to ask. Why did you say that? That goes pretty quickly. I should take this time to also say, when asking questions to others or having these discussions with people who disagree with us on the streets or at these rallies, hopefully, yeah, I like your approach to that, to make it quick and expedient, because they can just run away. If the conversation goes too long, they're just, I don't need to talk to you, and they'll just turn away and just run off. Oh, anyone I disagree with, nope, I don't need to talk to you, run away. So you at least can engage most of them for like one, maybe two questions if they bother to stop and talk at all. So that's, the quicker the better in that case. To people who are on the fence, even on the slightest amount, they'll still answer a question or two, and that's a great way to get them thinking. Ask them, go straight for why. Why did you say that? I heard what you said. Why did you say that? It's a great way to get them thinking. Plant a seed in just one statement. Now, for friendlies, for patriots, fellow patriots, I think it is incredibly important to ask why. I just want to say right now, I really I admire the work you're doing here. This is good work, and this is being emblazoned on the internet hopefully for generations. And I lastly want to mention the culture war, and how I believe it's the goal of the culture, this culture war, or this push in the popular culture, to make people dependent, to make people needy and reduced, clicked back into like a survival mode, into this state of just animalistic pleasure seeking and not really thinking for a big picture, for the big picture beyond themselves, with having creation in mind and where they fall into it, what role they play, what they were created to do.
If you'd like to hear more, subscribe. I have future interviews and episodes with other people's anecdotes and life experiences to come.